not testing enough. How do you get that balance?
I mean, in an ideal world, everybody would have all the testing capacity that they need, and the more testing, the better. But if we have shortages of things like reagents and apparatus that we need to process a test, you're going to have to prioritize. And it's really not an easy decision. It's not necessarily a scientific decision. It's a governmental decision.
What is the ideal situation, though? If you're a government, what are you thinking right now?
I opened position at British pound. The price I opened on 127,247. So position opened at 127,247. Long position.
Money into buying doses, hedging their bets, trying to make sure they have something. We don't know if they're going to work. So the safest approach is to assume that they won't work.
Jennifer, good morning. Tom Keene in New York. I want to go back to your original work in cell biology with your interest in virology and something called apoptosis, which basically I believe is cell death. I'm, of course, speaking as an amateur. And I want you to bring it over to this virus and young people. They're not going to die. I believe that's the generalization. But what happens to their cell biology while they're sick and after they're sick?
Tom, I'm afraid we really don't know. It's not something that we've been able to study much yet because there aren't that many cases of younger people who succumb to this virus. The viruses have an amazing array of weapons at their disposal. Also, we have a very strong immune response that can sometimes backfire and cause problems for our own body. So there simply haven't been enough studies long term because the virus has only been around since January. Yes, cell death is a serious issue, but I think more problem here is the immune response, the overreaction that our bodies are having to this infection.
Okay, what is the overreaction effect, again, on younger people? I would state as a generalization, in America, there's a feeling, okay, the young kids get the virus, whatever that age number is, I'll let you tell us. They get the virus and they get sick, but so what? They get better. Do they?
There have been a few fatalities, and some children get a very rare sort of toxic, sort of like an over-inflammation type of disease that can put them in the hospital. But yes, they don't tend to get very ill. That could be, as you suggest, that their immune systems are not yet mature, but we really don't know.
Do we know if they can still pass it on, Jennifer? There's also reports, and again, there's so much conflicting information, but certainly in the UK, the schools reopened, and there was an understanding that actually it was more difficult for kids to transmit, at least, you know, the really young kids, to transmit the disease.
And the bottom line is the more sick you are, the more virus you're going to shed. So by definition, anyone who's very ill or ill has any sort of symptom whatsoever is more likely to spread virus. Given that kids are less likely to suffer from effects of the virus, it's less likely they're going to have a viral load high enough to spread. Having said that, there is evidence that asymptomatic people can spread, and very good evidence. So again, I wouldn't rule this out, and there are more studies are needed. But I don't think kids are necessarily safe, and I think it's right that the schools are taking social distancing measures to keep that under control.
Well, somehow I think that'll be a theme for us, Dr. Rohn, as we move into August as well. Jennifer Rohn with UCL in London, a principal research fellow, and I just love that we've been doing this, folks, trying to bring you experts in medicine and in virology during this pandemic. Coming up at the next hour, it's always a joy to speak to Marvin Lowe. He's with State Street, but he has a really twisted, interesting view on global market strategy. That would help with equities to the moon, the VIX back to 23.96, and gold, 1882 the ounce. Marvin Lowe, the next hour. This is Bloomberg.
you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. John from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly.
Stop on profit for British pound at 127.267. I'm placing a stop on profit at 127.267.
This morning, the surge in gold, it continues, and with it, persistent dollar weakness as hope of economic recovery. It's extended out and well into 2021. What will the Republican Party look like after the president? Wait, what will the GOP look like the first week of August? It is red state, hand-to-hand combat on the stimulus. And after Houston, guess the American consulate to close. Speculation abounds from Wuhan west to Chengdu and then 845 miles southeast to Hong Kong. Good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance from our world headquarters in New York at our world headquarters in London, Queen Victoria Street. Francine Lacroix is, well, Francine, it's a really, one of our staff said it's a nudgy news day, and it's sort of nudgy. It's almost to August. Is Europe, like every year, going to shut down, or is this year different?
I think this year is different, Tom, because a lot of people are working from home, so that the time extends and people will continue working on holiday. I do think, Tom, when you look at the markets, they're probably a little bit range bound, and that's where the nudginess comes from. Because actually, in terms of news, we do have quite a lot of news. You have earnings in Europe, and that gives us a good insight into what companies are predicting. And of course, you have the spat between the U.S. and China, which is very significant, but it's not really translating into concrete market movements.
We'll talk about China here in a moment. Of course, the news flow there, Ritika will have it in a bit. Earnings today and airlines front and center. We're looking for Southwest to give us some love here in the 6 o'clock hour. Right now, I'll get it out with our first word news in New York City. Here's Ritika Gupta.
Morning, Tom. Francine. China may retaliate for the closing of its consulate in Houston by targeting the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong. That's according to the editor of the Chinese Communist Party newspaper, Global Times. He writes that the U.S. has over 1,000 staffers there, and that means it's obviously a spy center. The editor's comments have frequently been a tip-off to what the government does. The Trump administration and Senate Republicans are considering a short-term extension of extra unemployment benefits. It's unlikely that the White House and lawmakers will agree on a broader stimulus deal before the benefits expire. Millions of Americans received the supplemental payments that were included in the last coronavirus rescue package. And President Trump is now expanding a federal law enforcement operation to Chicago and Albuquerque, New Mexico. That sets up a showdown with state and local Democratic leaders who denounced the presence of federal agents in Portland, Oregon. The president says his goal is combating violent crime. The move is seen as an appeal to his conservative base. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is trying to head off growing support for Scottish independence. He'll stress the value of the United Kingdom in a visit to Scotland today. Tensions have been growing between the governments in London and Edinburgh. Issues include the coronavirus pandemic and calls by the Scottish National Party to hold another independence referendum. Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. Interesting. Equities, bonds, currencies, commodities, each of them with a story today. Equity surge up 16, Dow futures up 132, and the VIX a really stunning 23.85, showing the quiescence in the market. Bonds, okay, they're churning, but nevertheless persistent low yields. And then gold surging out. We're on the 2,000-ounce watch, $18.83 an ounce, up $18. Of course, silver with its own story as well. And the dollar, I'll let Francine talk to the dollar after our nice briefing from George Saravellos. Francine?
Yeah, Tom, the dollar is actually slipping for a fifth session. European stocks, U.S. equity futures, as you're saying, are up. Investors monitoring earnings pouring in. They're looking past the tensions between the U.S. and China. Gold up for a fifth day. Yuan strengthening offshore, and treasuries pretty much steady, Tom.
Off the presidential press conference, Francine, of the other day, I believe it was Tuesday now. I believe today's Thursday. Maybe it's a different President Trump. Here he is on Houston and the consulates.
As far as closing additional embassies, it's always possible. You see what's going on. We thought there was a fire in the one that we did close, and everybody said there's a fire, and I guess they were burning documents or burning papers, and I wonder what that's all about.
This story advances. Of course, the sequence that I saw yesterday was a little bit of Reuters speculation and then a sharp Bloomberg story out of China, which really showed that Wuhan was in some kind of consideration. And then the speculation on Chengdu to the southwest. Our bureau chief in Beijing, Ms. Chen, is there right now. And then over to Hong Kong with a very large consulate. What will they do there? Writing this herd of speculation is Rosalind Matheson. She's executive editor for speculation for Bloomberg, and we welcome her today. She's our international government editor. Rosalind, I make a joke about it, but it really is all speculation, isn't it?
It is indeed, because there are essentially 5 consulates the U.S. has in China, aside from the big embassy in Beijing, and then you've got Hong Kong as well. So it's sort of like pick one of these and see which one would hurt the most. But the reality is that China has to consider a proportional response to Houston, because while Xi Jinping can't let this one lie, he equally won't want to kind of escalate. So you need a response that sort of mirrors that action, and they'll be considering that carefully, because there are pros and cons, for example, in all of them, including Wuhan, and the nuclear option obviously would be to shut the consulate in Hong Kong.
But I mean, when do we find out what exactly is President Xi's game right now, Rose?
Well, right now they're confining themselves to rhetoric. They're saying the U.S. needs to think very carefully about where the relationship is heading, warning that this, of course, is bleeding into a bunch of other things. It could continue to bleed into a bunch of other things, including trade and so on. Obviously, with both their economies very weak right now, neither side would want that to potentially happen. But there's no indication of how quickly they're going to respond. We sort of see the state media in China channeling a bit of stuff, perhaps, to help point us in the right direction.
Position closed on British pound. I have 200 pounds profit. Position closed at 127.267.
Have on China itself, because just like shutting Houston not only affected China, it also damages the US, because you can imagine that all the big energy companies operating in China, the US companies will never get a visa again to go there. So there's a kind of a mutual issue there about how much does it hurt me versus how much it hurts you. And Shanghai perhaps would impact China significantly as well, whereas, for example, in Wuhan, where there are only a few US diplomats left at the moment, that wouldn't affect China so much, but in fact it could damage the US, because it would further cut off any access the America has to what really has been ground zero in the coronavirus. Hong Kong equally would have a huge impact on the US and less so on China. So it's all about that calculation, and in that regard, Shanghai is possibly off the table.
Is this, China against the world, Roz, and how linked is it to President Xi's leadership? And I think he needs to contest it again in 2022.
Well, that's right. It feels like it's a long way away. But every 5 years, China has a very big party congress where essentially they reaffirm the leadership, and in some cases they make changes. The last one in 2017, Xi essentially got a mandate to rule indefinitely. But even so, his leadership will be questioned at that meeting. And if the economy is still in a very bad place, if the coronavirus is out of control, and if he's not seen as being a strongly assertive leader, which is what he's obviously trying to demonstrate in all of this, is whipping up that nationalism, then it's possible you could see some questioning of his leadership and even a split So he has a strong incentive to continue to show his assertiveness both at home and abroad. And obviously that's rubbing up against other countries in a bunch of ways, increasingly also places like the UK and Canada and Australia, for example.
Well, you mentioned Australia. Rosalind, you're encyclopedic on this, so I can be unfair and ask a question about the geography of the South China Sea. It's getting a little play in the zeitgeist of the American press this morning with Woody Island triangulated between Manila, Taiwan, and then over to Vietnam. These little islands in the South China Sea, would you anticipate with our reporting that they will become an important discussion?